Hello, welcome to the Centre for Brexit Studies YouTube channel. Today we're joined by our Centre Director, Professor Alex de Ruyter. So Alex, the Bank of England has warned that the coronavirus pandemic will push the UK economy towards its deepest recession on record. This is obviously a really worrying time for businesses and livelihoods in the UK. So what can you see unfolding in the coming weeks?
Well, I think it's a given, given that the economy will shrink dramatically. I mean, we know that over 6 million people are currently furloughed, and that represents about a quarter of the entire employee workforce. If you add in the self-employed, then the figure is going to be higher yet. So I do think it goes without saying that if people aren't working, then their measured economic output is going to be minimal. So we can imagine, of course, that the economy will be at least 25% smaller this quarter coming than it otherwise would have been. And that, of course, assumes that the remaining 75% of the workforce are working at full productivity, which, of course, is doubtful given current restrictions. For many people, if they are, working from home as such and they have children, then they're going to be having to balance work with childcare and, of course, homeschooling. So, for a lot of people, even those nominally working, it's a real struggle. And I suspect, of course, that we'll gradually see a very slow uptick in economic activity from its low point. However, of course, large parts of the economy are going to remain shut. It's difficult to imagine sectors like hospitality, pubs, travel, passenger aviation in particular, getting back to normal anytime soon. And of course, the longer this goes on, the long-term damage will start to mount, and companies, of course, they'll run out of money and they'll go out of business, and then people will lose their jobs.
So the Bank of England also warns that UK unemployment to double because of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. Do you think this could force employers to get their staff back to work before it's actually safe to do so?
Well, look, I think it goes without saying that no responsible employer would want to do this. Of course, there's always going to be room for the unscrupulous few to exploit people, unfortunately. But I think a bigger problem is likely to arise in the context of small businesses who face a particularly invidious choice: get back to work or go out of business. And this is an issue for the self-employed in general, of course. To the extent that they can't access government support measures. So I could well imagine that some will feel enormous pressure, and especially since putting into place proper safety protocols will be expensive and in some cases almost impossible. Some employees and many self-employed people are likely to want to get back to work if it secures their job. They might feel that the risk is worth it, or that they have no real choice. If you think of people who've not been able to be furloughed, key workers, they might worry that they have health conditions, but if their only recourse is statutory sick pay at about £95 a week, well, they clearly can't live on that when they've got mortgages and have to pay. So there's a lot of pressure there. And I suppose, of course, when you have that, I don't particularly envy the small business owner or the manager who has to tell their workforce that they are closing down and making people redundant because it's become impossible to do their job safely.
So far then, the government's coronavirus job retention scheme has protected 6.3 million jobs at over 800,000 firms, but many workers are still being furloughed. Nearly 1 in 4 workers have been furloughed in the past fortnight. So what industries do you expect to bounce back fairly quickly when we're at some kind of normality? And what sectors do you think will feel the effects of this for years to come?
Well, of course, those in essential work will see things bounce back quickly. So, of course, we have the health service, care work, agriculture, freight transport, supermarkets, etc. They'll see minimal drops in their economic output. Of course, some of them, supermarkets will see increases in their profitability as the restaurant sector has been affected. So, of course, any losses that those sorts of businesses have had, they should recover those very quickly. Similarly, I can imagine that sectors where many people can effectively work from home will be less affected. It may be possible for academics to do more online work, for example, in terms of lectures. And, of course, schools and public transport functions will have to gradually reopen and will probably start to do so within the month or thereabouts. Then, of course, you talk about industries where it's possible that social distancing or physical distancing, protocols can be effectively put in place. Now, of course, how well this is done is an open question. may depend on the particulars of the individual business. If you think of a shop layout, for example, some shops have wide aisles, easy to spread people out. Other shops in small premises, that may be more tricky. I know that many manufacturers, of course, are already looking at, putting social distancing measures in place. The stand 1.5 metres apart or 2 metres in the UK, it's recommended. And a number of car plants are going to gradually reopen with reduced output. Similarly, many are keen to see construction work restart, and I can see this happening sooner rather than later. Of course, one caveat on that is that construction in London might need to wait a bit longer because of the heavy use of public transport there. Of course, we can't have a repeat of the situation prior to the beginning of lockdown where, you saw packed tube trains, the physical distancing and packed tube trains doesn't really work, much for the same reason physical distancing and a security queue at the airport doesn't work either. So, of course, on that note then, some industries will see long-term or permanent hits. If you think of so-called proximity services, other than, in other words, those that are very closely facing to the customer or consumer, businesses such as restaurants, pubs, leisure facilities, they're going to take a long time to reopen, and as a result, could have permanently lower levels of sales and profitability, or just not be profitable at all. International travel is going to take a long time to bounce back, and that, of course, will be need to also be increasingly mindful of environmental factors as it does so. I do think, though, that people will want to travel eventually. It's an innate human desire, really, isn't it, to go and explore. However, the way we shop and the way we work probably will change forever. Non-food retail outlets were struggling before this epidemic, and I can imagine that lockdown will have acted as a catalyst for change for many people. You think of the increased reliance now on click and collect, for example. Likewise, I think we could well see a permanent reduction in commuting travel as home working becomes more entrenched.
So the Prime Minister Boris Johnson is going to address the nation on Sunday to outline plans for the next stage of a lockdown, with the stay-at-home message is expected to be scrapped. That's because ministers are keen to obviously restart the economy. If we do return to some kind of normality then, and there are further waves of the coronavirus in the coming months and perhaps years, what impact do you think this could have on the government and in particular the Conservative Party?
Well, I think it'd be devastating. I mean, the government has already come under fire for its poor handling of the early stages of the outbreak, and the international press, of course, looks on aghast at the UK. I mean, we can debate the precise figures, but it is crystal clear that the death toll in the UK is going to end up amongst the worst in Europe on a per capita basis, and we might well end up taking the wooden spoon in that regard. Now, I mean, it's not an enviable position for any government to be in, especially as we've had a lot more warning than Italy, for example, and we just leapfrog them in terms of the death stakes. So, that's such a that they will desperately want to avoid any further spikes in deaths. And I suspect Johnson's personal experiences with COVID-19 in this regard will also play a role. We've seen what this disease can do. There won't be any dog ate my homework excuse, should there be a second peak. So, a very tricky path for the government to walk down going forward.
Thanks for joining us, Alex.
You're welcome.